And that did quiet him down for a little bit. You know, I'm not... I understand the impetus for this in the sense that these are people, after all, working in an industry and they are paying a lower tax bill than, say, I am. On the other hand, it's part of a broader framework of partnership taxation that's hard to really uncoil and to say, well, hedge fund managers should be taxed this way, but for instance, somebody running an oil and gas partnership should be taxed at a different level is harder to justify. So if you want to reconsider the partnership tax regime on a larger level and what it means to contribute the sweat equity versus what it means to contribute the capital, that's something you could think about, but to tease out a particular industry doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense.
I agree.
Okay. Yes.
When TARP was first set up, it seemed that the funds would be used to purchase the so-called toxic assets, take them off the balance sheets of the affected financial institutions, then freeing them up again to lend and act normally and knowing truly what their capital balance was, maybe not too differently from the way the Resolution Trust Corporation worked out the junk bonds on the savings bank's books and then sold them off at about 70 cents on what it cost them to take them on board several years later. Some of the program then seemed to morph into making capital investments into the balance sheets of a selected number of banks, which, not having cleaned up their balance sheets, didn't seem to work all that well necessarily in freeing them up to lend. Again, empirical evidence at least seems to show. I'd like the panel's comments on the wisdom of these two courses of action and what might have caused the change from what seemed to be the original intended course to what was actually done.
Well, well, a lot of what went on last year was, I think, panic in the crisis and just throwing anything against the wall and hoping something would stick. The real problem of buying the toxic assets was valuation. You had a huge, and you still do, have a huge bid-ask spread between what the institutions who have the toxic assets think they're worth and what a buyer in the marketplace is willing to pay for them. And then you have the federal government in the middle who's trying to, mediate between the two. And so that's why you see PPIP, this public-private investment partnership, which is sort of going back to the original intention of TARP, finally got off the ground, sort of, at least the identified managers, but it's a very tiny program. About $30 billion, I guess, is put aside, so everything's relative these days, I guess. But anyway, it really has not gotten that much traction, and there are trillions of dollars of supposed toxic assets out there that could be subject to this thing. So I think that is part of the problem. And then you have, of course, TARP morphing into things that I find very troublesome and not at all statutorily sound. That has to do with designating automobile companies as financial institutions and dumping TARP assets in it, even though the House passed a bill authorizing that to happen. The Senate refused to, and so, but the Treasury, and this is the Bush Treasury, went ahead and did it anyway, and that laid the groundwork for what we see going on today, where GMAC, I guess, is considered to be too big to fail and is getting more TARP funds, and it probably should just fail, frankly, and start over again. But anyway, so we have, this is an inherent problem of, I guess, this sort of ad hocery that came about last year.
The original idea behind TARP, of course, was that we had a liquidity crisis. And once we reestablished an active market for these assets, the liquidity crisis would be over and things would move along smoothly. The problem was we didn't have a liquidity crisis. We had a solvency crisis. These banks were by and large insolvent. And simply saying we're now going to reestablish a market for things on the asset side of your balance sheet so that you can value them would not solve that problem. And so either you've got to recapitalize them or you've got to use TARP to simply dramatically overpay for the assets, which is effectively the same thing.
Just may I ask a brief follow-up. I was wondering how much of the solvency crisis do you think was due to mark-to-market and how much was due to a real risk of insolvency of these institutions?
Well, I think mark-to-market certainly made the problem evident. Banks have this fundamental problem, which is that much of their funding is very short-term. and much of their asset side is long-term. And you can pretend that you don't have a problem on the asset side by not marking to market, but that doesn't mean you don't have a problem.
Yeah, just to chime in there as well, the real problem was in the implementation of mark-to-market by the accounting firms. And having been a partner once upon a time at an accounting firm, I know I've seen how those folks think. And unfortunately, at two firms in particular, they applied mark-to-market accounting in a bizarre way. They saw that there was under FAS 157, so this gets complicated. But anyway, they looked to some similar type of instruments, saw no market at all. They looked to indices, saw nothing going on. And even though these particular assets were cash flowing the way they should have been, the accountants said basically you have to mark them down to zero. So that then set off, there were cross default provisions in some of these structured products and everything else. So that sent whole big edifices crashing down when they shouldn't have been. And so that added panic to the marketplace. So a lot of it is to be blamed, I think, on the accountants. But, I mean, you can't blame them for everything because a lot of it, then why do they act that way? It's because of fear of litigation and fear of being second-guessed. So that ultimately is the root probably of all evil. But
And by the way, in the securitization market, if that's ever to pick up again, we're going to have new products. You have to decide between the tension of, on the one hand, the accountant's desire to have the financial institutions that hold any remaining pieces of these instruments carry all the instruments and their related liabilities on their balance sheets, and on the other hand, the sense that really you would have better instruments if the banks had to hold on to a piece of what they cooked, because that combination is proving fairly fatal.
Sir.
Many years ago, as a young law clerk, I had to read the legislative history of the 33 and 34 Acts, which was quite a task at the time. But what struck me in looking at those legislative histories was that as a consequence of the 29 crash and the aftermath, public trust in the public markets had been destroyed. And the securities industry had a fundamental problem at that time, which was the public didn't trust the markets and would not invest their money in the public markets. And the securities industry basically went crawling on its hands and knees to the Congress and begged for the regulatory scheme of the 33 and then 34 Acts so that the public would have the trust and confidence it needed to invest in these securities, which had proven, in many cases, fraudulent, and in many cases, too complex to understand. And, you'd lost, there was no transparency prior to that regulation. And as a consequence, the securities industry really was looking at a long-term catastrophe. So my question to the panel as a policy matter is, aren't we back there now? Are we back to where we were in 29 in the sense that there's now so much complexity both in the regulatory system, which at least one of the panelists I think has appropriately pointed out makes little sense and doesn't match up very well to the modern securities industry. In fact, I see a complete disconnect with the reality of the current securities markets and the regulatory system and the modern financial securities industry itself. Too much complexity, no transparency, and immense public distrust based upon the events of the last year or two.
So I guess I'd like to perhaps challenge a little bit of the premise. Legislative history, like all history, is written by the winners. And if you look at actual market conditions in late 1929 and into 1930, I think you would be surprised at how little actual panic there was. In fact, largely, if you look at news accounts and in particular accounts within the brokerage industry, there was unquestionably a sense of panic in October 1929. But it wasn't because of falling prices. I mean, prices fell roughly in the range of 25 to 30%. But the panic was that the back office couldn't keep up with the pace of transactions, and that leads to the wonderful film reels of people scurrying around as if things were falling apart.